Services are not only great for sharing data, they can also provide notifications. Welcome back to Angular Component Communication from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and in this module, we examine how to communicate through a service by broadcasting notifications. A service may have something important to say. A different product was selected, or the user just logged out. Instead of waiting for some component to ask for this new state, the service can broadcast a notification. Recall from the last module that we built a basic state management service. That service retrieves, manages, and stores state values, in addition to sharing those values with our components. However, it does not provide explicit change notifications. Now we'll move up the complexity scale and add notifications to our state management service. But it doesn't have to be a state management service. We can use the techniques presented in this module to add notifications to any service. In this module, we examine several techniques for broadcasting notifications from our service. First, we'll talk through why we don't want to use what seems like an obvious choice, an event emitter. Next, we discuss what a subject is and how to use it to broadcast notifications. Then we cover behavior subject and when to use it instead. Let's get started. In the prior module, we looked at how to use a service as an intermediary to communicate the selected product from the list component to the detail component. We achieved this communication by defining a property in a service, setting that property when the user selects a product from the list, and defining a getter to get the value from the service. When the user selects a product from the list component sets the current product property in the service. When the detail component needs that value, it pulls it from the service. If the user selects a different product, the list component changes the property value in the service, but the component is not aware of that change until it pulls that value. Luckily for us, if the getter property is bound in the template, change detection reevaluates the binding and calls the getter, which re-gets the value appropriately. But that is only true if the value is bound. Instead of waiting for a component to ask for new state, especially if the value is not bound, the service can broadcast a notification. This basically pushes the change to any component subscribing to those notifications. Let's walk through how a notification would work. Here we have our list of products. The user performs an action, such as clicking a button to select an item. The template uses event binding to catch that event and calls a method in the component. Instead of setting a service property as we did in the prior module, the component calls a method in the service, notifying it of the change. The service then broadcasts a notification. Any component or service can listen for that notification and respond accordingly. So how does the service broadcast this notification? The first technique that may come to mind is to use an event emitter, because we basically want to emit an event. Earlier in this course, we used an event emitter with an output decorator in a child component, so it could send notifications to its parent. In this example, we send out a notification every time the user changes the filter by value. But the output decorator technique shown here only allows communication between a child and its parent. We could set up something similar that doesn't use the output decorator, but best practices discourage use of the event emitter, except with an output property as shown here. And it's recommended that no code subscribe to an event emitter, meaning there is no way to get event notifications except through event binding in a template. So using an event emitter to broadcast notifications from our service is not a recommended option. A better choice for service notifications is to use a subject or a variant of a subject, such as behavior subject. What's that all about? Let's take a look, starting with a basic subject. A key purpose of a subject is to send out notifications. We can use a subject anywhere in our applications, but often encapsulate them in a service. But what is a subject? A subject is a special type of observable that can multicast a value or event to multiple subscribers. Any component or service that subscribes to the subject's observable will receive notifications. A subject is also an observer. An observer allows us to push new data into an observable sequence. Any component or other service can feed new values into the subject using its next method. The new value is then multicast to all subscribers. This sounds like just what we need if we want to use a service as an intermediary to pass notifications between our components. But let's step back a moment and remember that our application works perfectly fine without a subject. Since the detail template is binding to the current product property, Angular's change detection handles change notifications for us. Then why modify our code to use a subject? There may be situations where you can't use binding and you need explicit notifications from a service. So even though a subject is not required in this particular example, it's important to understand how to use them. Let's see how to change our code to use a subject. Before we jump into a demo, let's outline what we need to do, filling in more of the details from our earlier discussion. Here is our list of products. When the user selects a product in our list of products, the template catches that selection and calls a method in its component. We added this code in the prior module. In the onSelect method, instead of setting a property, we'll call a method in the service and pass in the newly selected product. In that service method, we receive the newly selected product and call the next method on the subject to push the new value into the observable sequence. This broadcasts the notification, passing along the selected product. The subject is declared here. We make it private so that no other code can access it. We define a second property and use the asObservable method of the subject to expose its observable. Any component or service can subscribe to this observable to receive notifications. Note that we could instead define the selected product source as public and allow subscribing to the subject directly. But then any other code could modify the subject or call its next method. By making it private, the actual subject is encapsulated in this service. We only expose its read-only observable. Then in the detail component, we subscribe to the subject's observable to receive a notification when the selected product changes, and display the values for the new product. Are we ready to give this a try? Even though our application works perfectly fine without it, in this demo we'll change our code to use a subject and broadcast explicit change notifications. Our list component will push the user-selected product into the subject's observable sequence, which in turn will broadcast that selected product to the detail component. We are back in the APM sample application once again, looking at the product service. Here we have the current product property that is tracking the user-selected product. Let's delete that and use a subject instead. We want to encapsulate our subject to ensure that no other code can use it directly, so we'll make it private. We'll call the subject selected product source, since it retains the source of knowledge about our selected product. To immediately work with our subject, we initialize it as a new subject. The generic parameter is the type of data we want to include in the notification, which in our example is a product. We'll specify iProduct union null to allow setting the selected product to null when there is no selection. Then we'll add the associated import for subject. Since we made this subject private, we need to expose a property that provides the associated observable. We'll call the property Selected Product Changes and postfix the property name with a $sign. By convention, this indicates that it is an observable and not a simple property. We initialize this property to this.selectedproductSource.asObservable. This exposes the read-only observable from our subject. We now have the observable part of our subject implemented. Any component or service can subscribe to this observable to receive notifications. But they won't receive any notifications until we push data into the subject's observable sequence. Let's do that next. Every time the selected product changes, we want to push that selection onto the observable. Where should this code go? It would make sense to add it to the list component so it can be called every time the user selects a new product. But since subject is private, we can only access its methods from within this service. Let's build a publicly facing method that wraps the subject method we need. I'll paste the code and we can talk through it. We take into this method the selected product. The type of this parameter can be iProduct when passing a product, or null if there is no currently selected product. In this method, we call the subject's next method to push the selected product into its observable sequence. The observable then broadcasts the notification, passing along the selected product. We've now set up the subject's observable so any component can subscribe to its notifications, and wrapped its observer so any component can push a new value to the subject, which is then broadcast to all subscribers. But we have a few syntax errors that we need to fix. The code in our delete product method cleared the current product property. We no longer have that property. We'll instead call our new method and pass in null. The null value is then pushed onto the observable sequence and broadcast to all subscribers. This makes sense because when the selected product is deleted, there is no selected product. The code in our createProduct method sets the current product to the created product. We'll also change this to call our new method, passing in the newly created product. This new product is then pushed onto the observable sequence and broadcast to all subscribers. This also makes sense because when a new product is created, we want it set as the selected product. What's left to do? Well, we don't currently have any subscribers, and we aren't yet pushing the user-selected product onto the observable sequence. Let's do this second task first. In the product shell list component, when the user selects a product from the list, we need to call our new service method and push that selection to the observable. So what do we change here? If you said the onSelected method, you are correct. In the onSelected method, instead of setting our original current product property, we call our service method and pass in the newly selected product. The service then pushes the selected product onto the observable and broadcasts it to all subscribers. Speaking of subscribers, we don't have any yet. Our product shell detail component wants to be notified every time the selected product changes so it can update its display. It currently uses a getter to ensure that it has the most recently selected product. But we have a syntax error here because the service no longer has this property. Instead of pulling new values with this getter, let's subscribe to receive notifications when the selected product changes. First, we replace the getter with a basic property declaration. Then we need to subscribe to receive change notifications. Where should we subscribe? If we want to start receiving notifications as soon as the component is initialized, we'll add it to the ngOnInit method. I'll paste the code and we can talk through it. We access the selected product changes observable and call its subscribe method. Within the subscribe, we get the selected product as part of the notification. We then set our local product property to the selected product. Since the template is bound to this product property, the new product will display. We now have one subscriber that responds each time the user selects a product. Let's check it out in the browser. If we made all of these changes correctly, it should work as before. And it does. Whoosh. But to really show off the multicasting, we need more than one subscriber. To see how the multicasting works, let's implement a second subscriber using our product shell component. We've received a request to modify the product shell component so it displays the number of months on the market for the selected product. It then needs notification when the product changes so it can recalculate the value for display. Looking at the product shell component, we see that it already has a month count property, and that the template is binding to this property. The problem is we are not setting this property anywhere yet. We want to calculate it each time the user picks a different product. How do we do that? If you said subscribe to the subjects observable from our service, you are correct. The product shell component does not currently inject the product service, so let's start there. We'll inject the service into the constructor and add the associated import. Then, similar to the product shell component, we want to subscribe to receive the notifications. Where? To start receiving the notifications right away, we'll again use ng on init. I'll paste the code and we can talk through it. Here is the subscribe. Within the subscribe method, we calculate the number of months between the product's release date and the current date. First, we ensure that we have a selected product. If so, this code sets the start as the product's release date. The release date is stored as a string, so we use the JavaScript date constructor to convert it to an actual date. Then we set the current date. Next, we approximate the month count by subtracting the current month from the release month and adding an appropriate number of months based on the difference in years. This won't give us an exact number, but a value close enough for our purposes. And just a reminder that we could have instead put similar code into a product count getter and used our original current product property. We would then have this same functionality without the need for a subject. Checking it out in the browser, click on a product and it appears on the right, and the number of months on the market is displayed here at the top. Click on another product and see the number of months change. Each time the user picks a different product, our product shell list component asks our service to add the selected product to its observable, which sends out notifications. Both our product shell and our product shell detail are receiving those notifications and reacting appropriately. Before moving on, let's try something. Pick SAW, click to edit, and cancel. Upon returning to the list, we lost our selection. Bummer. If we pick another one, we do see its detail and number of months on the market. Why didn't it display correctly after an edit? And how do we fix it? When the user navigates between the product shell page and the product edit page, the product shell page, along with the product shell list and the product shell detail, are destroyed. The edit page is initialized and displayed. When the user completes or cancels the edit page is destroyed and the product shell page once again appears, but with no product detail. Throughout this process, our service subject still retains the last selected product. When the product shell and product shell detail components are initialized, they again subscribe to the selected product changes observable. The problem is they don't receive a notification of the last set value, so they won't know about a selected product until the user picks another one. How do we fix that? How about a different kind of subject? We've just gone through the code for using a subject. We used it to provide notifications from our service to any component that subscribes. But what if we need slightly different functionality? Luckily for us, there are several variants of subject available to us. One such variant is a behavior subject. A behavior subject works like a subject except for two key features. It requires an initial value, and it always provides the current value on any new subscription. What does that mean for us? Let's walk through our edit scenario again, but this time with a behavior subject. When the user navigates between the product shell page and the product edit page, the product shell page along with its children are destroyed. The edit page is initialized and displayed. When the user completes or cancels the edit page is destroyed, and the product shell page again appears. Throughout this process, our service still retains the last selected product. When the product shell and product shell detail components are initialized, they again subscribe to the selected product changes observable. Only this time, since we are using a behavior subject, it provides the last selected product on each new subscription, so the components can react accordingly. That's what we want. How do we change our code to use a behavior subject instead? Let's jump back to a demo and try out this same scenario, but with a behavior subject. Changing our code from one variant of a subject to another is easy. In the product service, we change the subject to behavior subject and add the needed import. Unlike the subject, a behavior subject expects an initial value. We pass in a value of null to the constructor since no product is initially selected. That's it. Let's see how that little change affects our application. Bringing up the browser, select a product, and we see the details on the right and the number of months here at the top. It's working as before. Now let's select a product for edit and cancel. Notice now that when we return, the last value of the selected product was provided. We see the current product details here and the correct number of months on the market here. It now works, even when the components are destroyed and reinitialized. Such a small change, but a big impact on the usability of the application. One other fix we may want to consider here. Notice that when we return, the detail appears with the correct product, but the list itself doesn't show that the product was selected. What to do? The list can also subscribe to the subject's observable and be notified of changes. So these subject techniques presented here can also be used for a component to communicate with itself. Going back to the code, let's open the product shell list and its template to the side. Let's start by adding a property to the product shell list to hold the selected product. Then in the template, we'll use ng-class to set the active style class. We set it when the ID of the product displayed on a button matches the ID of the selected product. And notice the safe navigation operators here in case the values are null. What's next? The code to subscribe here is similar to what we added to the product shell and product shell detail components. Want to give it a try yourself? If so, pause the video now. How did you do? Here are the changes I made to the product shell list component. I added the subscribe in the ng on init and set the selected product within the subscribe method. Does yours look similar? Viewing it in the browser, we can see that it works as before, but now the selected product has a more obvious style. And when we click to edit and return, the product shell detail appears correctly on the right. The number of months is shown at the top, and the appropriate product is shown selected in the product shell list on the left. We are now subscribing from 3 components. Before moving on, let's clean up a bit and unsubscribe when we're done. We are looking at the product shell detail component. Let's clean it up just a bit. To prevent memory leaks, we should turn off the subscription when we are finished with it. We normally do that in the onDestroy lifecycle hook. We begin by implementing onDestroy and add the associated import. Then we create a property to hold the subscription. It is of type subscription, and we again add the import. When we subscribe, we store the subscription in this new property. And in the ng-on-destroy method, we unsubscribe to clean up. I'll leave it to you to clean up our other two subscriptions using similar code. Let's finish up this module with some guidelines for using the communication mechanisms covered in this module. As we've seen throughout this course, guidelines are helpful when evaluating communication techniques. The first question we should ask ourselves is whether a service needs a subject or one of its variants at all. It doesn't need a subject if notifications are not required. If the service is simply a bag of properties or shares entity data, it may not need to provide notifications. And you don't need a subject if the notifications are for changes to bound properties. Prior to this module, our components use change detections and getters, and all of the features we added in this module can be accomplished with similar techniques. No need for a subject. You do need a subject if the service needs to provide notifications, and those notifications are more than just changes to bound properties. As a side note, subjects also have purposes beyond component communication. For example, you can use them to sync multiple observables, but those uses are beyond the scope of this course. Once you determine that your service does need a subject, the next question is, which variant? Use a plain subject if there is no initial value and the service only broadcasts items as they are pushed to the observable. Use a behavior subject if you want an initial value and if the service needs to provide the most recent item upon subscription and then broadcast items as they are pushed. If you have slightly different requirements, such as always providing all prior values upon subscription, check out additional variants of subject here. This module covered how to broadcast service notifications. We looked at why we should not use an event emitter, and then examined how to use a subject and a behavior subject. Here once again is our diagram of increasingly complex techniques for managing state as a communication mechanism. In this module, we added notifications to our state management service, but we could have added them to any service. Our components can then subscribe to these notifications and react as needed. If you are interested in taking the complexity up further, check out the Play-by-Play Angular and NGRX course in the Pluralsight library. With that, we are finished using services as an intermediary for communication between our components. Up next, let's look at routing. Angular's router provides several unique ways to communicate information between components. Welcome back to Angular Component Communication from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and in this module, we communicate between our components using the router. Sometimes we just want to pass a little information from one route to the next. The router provides easy-to-use features to do just that. Looking at our component communication diagram, we've covered how a component communicates with its template, including child components on that template. And we've examined techniques for components to communicate using a service as an intermediary. We can leverage these techniques to communicate between our routed components. But if we just want to pass a bit of data from one route to the next, the router provides an easy way to do that without the need for a service. In this module, we start with a quick review of routing basics. Then we take a high-level look at passing data to a routed component using several kinds of route parameters: required, optional, and query parameters. Let's get started. The primary purpose of routing is to provide a mechanism for the user to navigate through an application. Let's think back to our original user interface design for a moment and do a quick review of how basic routing works to ensure we are all on the same page with the terminology. Most applications provide some way for the user to navigate between features, such as a menu or toolbar. In the HTML for the menu or toolbar, we use the router link directive. The router link defines the route to activate when the user selects the specified option. In this example, we activate the products route. The address bar is then modified to include the specified route. The router sees the change to the address bar and sequentially examines the list of route configuration paths for a match. It selects the first match it finds. It then loads the specified component. In this example, it's the product list component. The router looks for a router outlet directive specifying where to put the routed view. It then displays that view in the location defined by the router outlet. That's how basic routing works. We can expand on these basics and define multiple router outlets for child routes or secondary routes, often called auxiliary routes. In our original sample application, we have a router outlet specified in our app component. Notice that the app component's template has no menu, header, footer, or any other display elements, just the router outlet. We route to this router outlet to display a page without any accessories, such as for a login page. We also use this router outlet to display our application shell component. This app shell component includes our heading and menu. The app shell component contains a child router outlet. It is here that we route any views that we want to display with a menu, such as our original product list page. To better demonstrate communication between non-routed components, we modified the products route to instead display a product shell component. Inside the product shell component, we define both the product shell list and product shell detail components as child components, so we no longer route between these two components. We do still use routing to navigate to the product shell component and to the product edit component. Currently, in our sample application, our route configuration in the product module looks something like this. The default products path routes to our product shell component, and we aren't using the path to the product detail component since the detail is defined as a child component in this design. If you want to examine the routing features provided in the original user interface design, simply change the default products route configuration to route to the product list component instead. If routing is new for you, or if you want to learn more about the many features of routing, check out the Pluralsight course, Angular Routing, or the book, Angular Router, by one of the original members of the Angular team. In this module, we'll take a high-level look at using route parameters to communicate between routed components. For more information on route parameters, including detailed demos, see the Angular Routing course. With route parameters, we can pass a bit of data from one component to another on the route. Let's walk through a route parameters example using our original user interface design. When the user clicks on one of the products, we want to route to the product detail. We need to provide the ID of the product so the detail knows which product to display. It seems like overkill to create a service just for this purpose. Instead, we can pass data between routes using route parameters, such as the ID of 5 shown here. The routed component can then read the parameter from the route and display the correct product. Angular provides 3 different types of route parameters with slightly different syntax for each: required, optional, and query parameters. Let's look at each one and when you would want to use it. Like its name suggests, use a required parameter when the route requires a parameter. For example, the detail and edit pages cannot display the appropriate content without knowing the ID of the item to display. When using required parameters, the parameters must be defined as part of the route configuration. Each required parameter is denoted with a colon and a placeholder name, as shown here. We can add any number of parameters separated with slashes. To activate a route with a required parameter, use the router link. Specify the parameters as additional elements in the associated array. To activate a route in code, use router.navigate and pass in the same array. The resulting URL will look something like this. The routed component can then read the parameter from the route using syntax like this. The parameter passed into the get method here must exactly match the placeholder name here. So this is how we set up and use required parameters, but there are other types of route parameters we can use. Sometimes we want to communicate optional information on a route. We do that using optional or query parameters. For example, here is a product search page we could add to our sample application. Using this page, the user can specify any desired search criteria. We then pass the enter criteria along to the product list page. We don't want to make each of these elements required, so using optional or query parameters is a better choice. When defining optional parameters, we don't specify them as part of the route configuration. We instead specify the parameters when activating the route, either in the template or in the code. The optional parameters are specified as a set of key and value pairs in a single element of the array. The resulting URL looks a bit odd, with the key and value pairs separated with semicolons. The routed component can then read the parameters using syntax like this. The argument to the get method is the key from the key and value pair. Just like optional parameters, query parameters are not specified as part of the route configuration. We instead specify them when activating the route, either in the template or in code. With query parameters, we have an additional directive, query params. We assign query params to the set of key and value pairs defining the query parameters. The resulting URL may look more familiar as it follows the standard syntax for query parameters. Reading the route uses a different property. Here we use query param map instead of param map. The argument to the get method is again the key from the key and value pair. So the optional and query parameters are different in syntax and generate different URLs. But query parameters also support an additional feature. We can use query or optional parameters to communicate a set of key and value pairs to another component using the route. But only the query parameters can automatically retain those parameters and pass them back. In this example, the parameters passed back from the product list could be used to set defaults when the user returns to the product search page. Use route parameters anytime you want to communicate a bit of data from one route to the next. Just be sure to select the type suitable for your needs and use the syntax appropriate for your selected type. To walk through complete code examples of each of these, check out the Angular routing course in the Pluralsight library. How about some guidelines for using route parameters? Route parameters are often the best way to pass a bit of data from one component to another on the route. Parameters are preferred over services or other techniques because they are simple, straightforward, and the resulting route URLs are bookmarkable and shareable. For example, if a user wants to share the detail for Product 7 with another user, they can simply email the URL. The recipients can click on the URL and be taken directly to the detail for Product 7. But keep in mind that any specified parameters appear in the URL, so it's not a good candidate for information that you don't want the user to see. It's also not good for large amounts of data. For example, you would not normally use a route parameter to pass a complex object, such as a product, from one route to the next. Bottom line, use route parameters to pass small amounts of data between routed components. Use a service instead if you want to share objects or need to share data between components that are not routed. Once you've determined that you want to use a route parameter, the next question is, which kind? Use required parameters when specific data must be provided to the routed component. Routing from the product list to the product detail or product edit are examples. The product detail and product edit must have the parameter to know which product's detail to display or edit. Use optional parameters when the data is optionally provided to the routed component. For example, a product search page with optional criteria selections. Use query parameters instead of optional parameters when the data is optionally provided to the routed component, but a query style URL is desired, or the data should be retained across routes. This module took a quick look at using the router for communication between components. We reviewed router basics and then briefly examined how to use each of the three types of route parameters: required, optional, and query parameters. We've now looked at communication between a component and its template, using a service as an intermediary for communication between components, and using route parameters to pass data between routed components. Only one short module left. As you have seen throughout this course, Angular provides numerous ways for components to communicate. Welcome back to Angular Component Communication from Pluralsight. My name is Deborah Kurata, and the final words in this course include a recap, along with a few pointers to additional information. Let's jump right into this short module. The components and other parts of our application need to work together to get things done. And to work together successfully, they need to communicate clearly. We started with communication between a component and its template. We reviewed how to communicate values from the component to the template using binding, and how to react to users' changes using the long form of two-way binding, getters and setters, or the value changes observable. We examined how to use viewChild, or viewChildren, to get a reference to a native element so we can access its HTML properties or call its HTML methods, such as its focus method. Or use viewChild, or viewChildren, to reference the ngForm or ngModel directive on an element and access its data structures. Those data structures provide state information, such as whether a form is dirty or a control is valid. There are additional techniques available when communicating between a parent component and a child component. Recall that a component is a child or nested component only if the component resides directly in the template of the parent component. We saw how a parent can pass a value to the child component using a property marked with the input decorator. We examined how a parent component can get a reference to the child component to access its properties or perform an action by calling its methods. If a child component wants to notify the parent component of an action or pass it some data, use an event emitter property with the output decorator and emit an event to send a notification to the parent component's template. Next, we discovered how services are a great intermediary for communication between components. We started with a simple property bag service that retained property values for a component to communicate with itself, though we could also use that technique to communicate with other components. We examined how a state management service can retrieve, manage, store, and share entity data. We then looked at techniques for sending notifications between components using a service with a subject or behavior subject. Lastly, we examined how to use routing to pass a required value from one component to the next via the route, and discussed how to use optional or query parameters to pass optional values on the route. Wow, we've covered a lot in this course. For your reference, here is a summary. First is communication between a component and its template, including techniques for notifying the component when the user makes a change in the view. Then the additional mechanisms when communicating between a parent and child component. Here are the techniques used for the parent to communicate with the child, including ways for the child to react to changes made by the parent. And here is how a child component communicates with its parent. A service provides a great intermediary for a component to communicate with itself or other components. We looked at several ways for using a service. Lastly, we looked at how to use route parameters as an additional option when communicating between routed components. Want to know more? Let's look at some resources. This course covered many techniques, but there is always more to learn. Here are some related Pluralsight courses. Play-by-Play Angular and NGRX introduces and demonstrates NGRX, the powerful state management library inspired by Redux. If you are new to forms, check out Angular Forms or Angular Reactive Forms. And for more information on routing, check out the Angular Routing course. It includes additional routing techniques, such as route resolvers and route guards. Congratulations! You've made it through the key techniques for component communication. Yay! We've covered lots of different techniques you can use as you build your own applications, and I'm sure you'll find more as you continue learning. I'd love to hear about them. Reach out to me on Twitter or on the discussion page for this course. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed component communication with Angular.